Hello, you're listening to Lists and Other Things That No One Asked For, your weekly mini podcast where it usually takes the form of a list, usually something pop culture-y like music, books, movies, sometimes about growing up. Thanks for listening. I've mentioned this before, but if you were a sad, introverted kid, the library was your favorite place. I was always reading, but I was never really interested in nonfiction. I was only interested in novels and fiction. Over the course of my life, there have been a handful of books that I've read that absorbed me so deeply in the story that I couldn't put them down. I think back on the first time I read them and I wish I could read them again for the first time, either because there's a twist that I now know and I won't be able to enjoy when I reread it, or I just want to get that spellbound feeling that you get when you're reading a good book. A lot of these books I finished in a day or so. Ones I had a hard time putting down. That was my criteria. Mild spoilers ahead. Don't say I didn't warn you, although they are pretty mild. Really only spoil one. Anyway, I spoil Ender's Game. Everything else I don't spoil, I don't think. The first book that springs to mind is Hunting for Hidden Gold, one of the Hardy Boys novels. I loved these as a kid, and imagine my surprise when I realized in my 20s, quite late, that Franklin W. Dixon was a pseudonym for a whole stable of authors who were cranking out Hardy Boys books assembly line style to sell as many books as possible to young kids. I felt a bit betrayed initially, but it doesn't change the fact that most of them were really good. It also turns out that a lot of the early novels, including this one, were written by a Canadian author named Leslie McFarlane. These books already felt dated when I read them in the 90s, but I love them anyway. I particularly love this one because it has a ghost town, and I love a good ghost town. It also has a supernatural element. It lets you wonder if there really are ghosts, if this town really is haunted. And then they chase a bad guy through some abandoned mines, and for whatever reason, this was really thrilling to me, especially as a young person. Next is Dead Silence by S.A. Barnes. It's another one where you're guessing up to the last minute if it's something supernatural or if there's a rational explanation for all the mysterious stuff people are seeing. Is it ghosts? Is there some other explanation? In this one, a survey crew finds an abandoned ship with a bunch of dead people on it that has been missing for years. They have to figure out what happened to all the dead people. The atmosphere of this book is so delightfully creepy and enjoyable. I wish I could read it again, not knowing what the ending is. I won't spoil it, but a lot of times when spooky books finally explain what's going on, it's either too vague in order to be mysterious, or it doesn't make sense. But here, I found the explanation and the payoff super satisfying. It explained everything and made sense with what happened before. I also wish I could read Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card for the first time. I just like an alien invasion story, and I thought this one was done really well. I like the idea that the nations of the earth could come together to repel an alien invasion, which seems quaint in these divided times. They really got me with the title. I really thought it was a war game. When I realized Ender had been fighting the actual alien enemy the whole time, my mind was blown. And then when he got the Formic egg at the end, mind doubly blown. I've liked some of the Formic prequels and some of the sequels, but nothing beats this first one for me. I would also like to read this for the first time for two reasons. First, I'd like to feel that surprise again, and second, when I read it the first time, I was blissfully unaware of Orson Scott Card's politics. I went to see him when I was in college, and he was giving a speech, and he kicked it off with denying climate change, and I tuned out after that. I wish I could divorce that from the whole reading experience. Next, a book that doesn't get enough credit is A Wizard of Earthsea. I had read some fantasy like C.S. Lewis, Lloyd Alexander, and some Tolkien until I got bored to tears and quit from exhaustion. That dude loves descriptions. Ursula Le Guin felt totally different. I liked that while Ged was really gifted in magic, it was different than a typical Chosen One type story. He kept making serious mistakes. The main antagonist is something he created, and eventually it becomes about him embracing his own darkness. Le Guin also invented the Ansible, which factors heavily into the Ender's Game. Next, Old Man's War by John Scalzi, which is probably the fastest I can ever remember reading any book in recent memory. There's no twist or anything, I just love the feeling of discovering this near-future science fiction universe that was so familiar but so new. I like military science fiction, i.e. Starship Troopers, and to that classic formula, Scalzi adds snappy dialogue and the unique idea of enlisting in the military as an older person in order to get a fresh, new body. As far as the story goes, it was a small twist on the normal military science fiction tropes, but it was such a unique take on the genre that I couldn't stop reading it. Whereas a lot of the motivation in older military science fiction is about patriotism and king and country and the indomitable human spirit, Scalzi instead carefully sprinkles in some thoughts on war and why it gets waged, and these have no delusions about glory or honor. And now we've arrived at the book I'd most like to read again for the first time, which is Down a Dark Hall by Lois Duncan. I think Duncan had a lot of big twists in her work. I Know What You Did Last Summer, anyone? She was kind of like a middle grade M. Night Shyamalan, and the twist in this book blew my mind. I won't spoil it, but a girl goes to a boarding school in a creepy gothic mansion, and like any other good slow burn horror, possibly haunted house story, the tension builds just ever so slowly. You know something is wrong, but when it all comes out, in the end, I was freaking out. Also, side note, Lois Duncan lived in Albuquerque for a long time. She taught at the University of New Mexico. So she's a fellow Burqueña, I think. Honorable mention. These are short stories, but I wish I could read them again for the first time because they do have twists and they are shocking. And I still like reading them, but I'll never have my mind blown the way I did the first time. So the first one is The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. And then the second one is The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Man, I love making lists. Thanks for listening. For next week, if you're playing all at home, we're going to be listing our guilty pleasure songs, shows, books, movies, etc., pieces of pop culture and media. Thanks for listening. I hope you find making lists as therapeutic as I do. We have a new episode every Monday. If you need to get a hold of me, I'm on social media at Jesse Barbin. Submit your questions at the top of my link tree. Have a good week. I've mentioned this before, but if you were a sad... Well, that's a good start.